You're good.
Okay, so welcome everyone, SISE's 64 fellows and the public audience out there on YouTube. Thank you for joining us. This is the third day of SISE. It's a day about data and informed change. In the morning, that's our morning panel session. We'll have a keynote talk from MK Dorsey of Sunrise at 12:45, and a panel in the afternoon on activism and change. So this has been a wonderful 2 days. We're looking forward to a third day, which is going to be, I think, equally both engaging and challenging. Our panel for data as a tool for change has 4 members. Let me introduce them quickly. Marcella Bonde-Keenan, who is the Director of Climate Planning and Programs for the Center for Neighborhood Technology, which is a local Chicago institution, many decades old and sort of famous in Chicago for dealing with practical problems. Her work focuses on helping communities mitigate and adapt to climate change hazards and realize the benefits of green building practices. One of her key projects is Rain Ready on urban flooding, and she'll tell you about that. She holds a Master's of Urban Planning and Policy from University of Illinois at Chicago, is the host of SISE, Bachelor's in Biology. She's a native Chicagoan and a Latina, the very proud recipient of the 2020 Chicago United for Equity Fellowship. Next panelist is Jocelyn Leitzinger, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Assistant Professor, College of Business Administration at UIC. She examines how activists pressure firms and industries to change their socially and environmentally detrimental practices, as well as how the targeted firms and markets push back against this pressure, and especially through the creation of corporate front groups. She's explored these phenomena in several industries, including an emphasis on firm misconduct, and that will be a very interesting presentation. Eric Nost is Assistant Professor of Geography at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. He studies how digital data and technologies inform environmental policy, including mapping the uneven outcomes of well-intended policy initiatives. He's developed methods for tracking the changing portrayal of issues like climate change on the web. That's also going to be extremely informative. And finally, Anna Wolf, Senior Project Manager for Urban Resilience at the Center for Neighborhood Technology. She joined CNT in 2015, works on water and transportation issues. She manages research and outreach for the Great Lakes Water Infrastructure Project at CNT, and coordinates efforts on stormwater management and water infrastructure financing. Prior to joining CNT, Anna worked at the Alliance for the Great Lakes on water resource management and invasive species policy. So we have a real spectrum of panelists who will be able to cover the initiatives that need to be taken in Chicago and elsewhere. So I'm going to ask the panelists each to take 7 to 10 minutes to present their high-level perspectives with slides in some cases on how technology, business, and policy affects change, followed by questions from the fellows and questions and comments to the panel members to explore their views more deeply. And it's during these discussion periods that we've gotten down, really taken deep dives into the issues. So let's start if we can, and maybe Marcella, would you like to start off? And I'm going to ask each panelist, spend a minute or so talking about yourself. So how you got where you are in your career, why you made the choices you made, what you're really passionate about. I think that would be really useful for the fellows who are just finishing their educations and looking to start their careers. So I think that kind of information would be really helpful. So Marcella, would you like to start off? Whoop.
Hey, Marcel, I think
You might be muted.
Okay.
There we go.
There you
Yeah.
go. Good now. All
Yeah.
right. So as I was saying, former SISE alum, so very glad to be here. So in terms of my passions, it really is in the areas of environmental justice, spatial justice, and equity. Um, I am a planner, an environmental planner, climate planner, but I spent a long time in environmental consulting before that, doing soil and water remediation, testing, a variety of projects, which was a really nice sort of basis for them being able to move more into systemic issues that CNT addresses. And George, did you want me to move into slides, or are we going to introduce everyone first?
No, let's go into slides, please do. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I will go ahead and share my presentation. Give me one moment. So I'm going to be presenting some research that CNT completed somewhat recently about urban flooding and social equity. So as George mentioned, CNT has been around for about 40 years. We're based in Chicago, but we do work around the country by the request of various local governments and community groups. Urban flooding is an area that we started to look at starting in 2012. So essentially before this, flooding was defined really by FEMA's flood insurance risk maps, which models only the risk from rivers and coasts. So it predicts what would happen if a storm of a certain size hit a particular river or a particular lake. But we knew from living in Chicago and from talking to people that this is not exactly what people were experiencing. In fact, Chicago has very few floodplains. So we did a study where we took a different approach. We identified actual historic flooding areas. We did this through getting insurance claim data related to flood damage, looking at 311 data, holding structured interviews with residents, and holding community forums. And we learned a variety of things. From our 2014 report, we found that the average payout per insurance claim holder was over $4,000, but many people were reporting flooding repeatedly. Some people 5 or more times. So you can imagine how expensive that gets to be over the course of their tenure in their home. They also reported additional health and job impacts, a lot of stress, lost wage hours, lost leisure time, a lot of both mental and respiratory impacts. And most importantly, perhaps, we confirmed that most flooding indeed occurs outside of the floodplain, not just for Chicago, but for the entire county that we're in. And this is a problem because federal dollars and federal programs are really just geared at this riverine and coastal flooding. In the state of Illinois, followed up with a statewide report using a similar methodology. They looked at statewide insurance claim data. They found that the number of insurance claims over this 7-year period is quite high, over 300,000, and over $2 billion paid out in damages. 99% of all of our counties were impacted. So even though Illinois does have some floodplains in some areas, there are many areas they're not. And from the state of Illinois' report, they found that the percentage of insurance claims, so documented flood damage that occurred outside of a FEMA floodplain, was over 92%. Again, confirming that there's a real mismatch between what the federal policies and programs and dollars were going towards and what people and communities were experiencing. The state of Illinois report, as well as CNT study, show that low and moderate income families are more impacted by flooding. You can see on the chart that there's a peak around $50,000 per household, which is quite low if you consider that that's everyone who lives in the household. That's their entire income. So in 2018, CNT followed up by looking more specifically at the racial impacts of flooding in the city of Chicago. Some of you probably know that Chicago is extremely segregated. And so therefore you can look really at zip code data and see some very clear demographic patterns. We looked at insurance claim data for a 9-year period. We found that 95% of our zip codes were impacted. So even though, again, hardly any floodplains, nearly every zip code had flood insurance payouts. Quite over $250,000 insurance claims during this period, over $400 million in damages paid. And I'll just say again that damages paid is not the same as damages sustained, because if you've ever been through an insurance process, it's not really a one-to-one ratio. But most importantly, 87% of the claims paid were made in communities of color by zip code, by which I mean communities of color, meaning non-Hispanic white communities. So everyone who's not in that category. You can see this in a couple of maps. The one on the left is the flood insurance claims map. This is going to affect mostly homeowners who are required to carry insurance. So I'll just say that the data is likely underrepresenting the state of the problem, particularly since in lower income households, the family home may have been inherited. And once you're out of a mortgage, you're no longer required to carry flood insurance. So they may never have had the opportunity to get damages paid. You can see in red the area that has the most claims, and then you can see hatched in purple and in blue the areas that are predominantly communities of color. Purple is 59% and more. You can see from the map that it's mostly the south and the west sides of Chicago, and then north is sort of that middle of the ground. And you can, if you know Chicago fairly well, you'll just sort of know instinctually this is largely where our Black and brown neighborhoods are. So because the claim data is not all inclusive, we also took a look at 311 flooding calls. You can see a similar pattern here where there's particular neighborhoods on the south and the west side that are being very chronically hit by flooding. Just to ground it a little bit, this is what it looks like in somebody's home. Hopefully you've never experienced this. But this can happen even in moderate storms because of the capacity of the sewer system itself. It backs up into basements. It may flow underneath basement doors or basement windows. May even pond really extremely in yards. So just a quick question, given the current circumstances, what does it mean to shelter in place when your home is flooded? This is more of a philosophical question. People can't necessarily evacuate to a place that's any safer if their home looks like the previous picture. However, there are some solutions. I wanted to just end with, because the research is a bit depressing, there are some nature-based flooding solutions that can be taken at the neighborhood scale. So, you know, one idea is a network of green infrastructure projects that it's engineered across a neighborhood. So thoughtfully installed, not just sort of, you know, give a grant to a homeowner, maybe they'll do something with it or put in an occasional bioswale here and there, but an actual network that's been thought out and planned for stormwater flow. This can provide a flexible, adaptable, and relatively affordable stormwater utility service that will supplement traditional sewer systems. Since sewer construction projects are lengthy and expensive, this is a way to kind of sort of triage where you have neighborhood problem points. I'll also say that there is a link between green infrastructure and community priorities and well-designed programs. So of course, all of these strategies on the left-hand column have flooding benefits, but they may also have air benefits. A lot of lower income communities also struggle with air pollution problems. It can help with heat stress, you know, by providing tree canopy. It can also support a jobs training program, things like that. So that's my mini presentation. If you're interested in this particular report, here's the information here. You can go to our website and look under publications. There's also an interactive map, and there's a blog post that summarizes the story, but also talks about what it looks like in a particular neighborhood in Chicago's Southeast Side. So thanks for your time.
Marcella, thanks so much. That was a great intro, and I see already one question in the chat. I would encourage the fellows, if you have questions about Marcella's presentation, please put them in chat, and we'll get to them when we get to the question period. So let's move on. And Jocelyn, would you like to give an intro to yourself and then some overview of your work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So my name is Jocelyn Leitsinger. As was mentioned, I am an assistant professor of management in the Managerial Studies Department in the Business School at UIC. I got to this point on a long and twisty path. So I did my undergrad and my master's at University of Florida. I did advertising, marketing, and then international business. And during my master's, 9/11 happened. So for those of you that feel like you're entering into a very uncertain economic time, I totally understand what that's like. I've been through that myself and got really creative with things. I actually started my own consulting firm and got my own projects, which I did for about 5 years, and then just kind of decided that I wanted something different. So I went to grad school, and even grad school was a long and twisty path. I am first generation in college, and so didn't have a lot of advice or people to turn to on how to apply to PhD programs, and I made pretty much every mistake out there. So if any of you are ever thinking about doing a PhD, please talk to me. You can learn from my mistakes and skip them so that you can do better. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so you guys get my slides. All right, and we'll get started. So I'm going to give you guys a peek behind the curtain per se, and we're going to talk about some of the strategies that firms use in non-market environments in order to pursue their interests, oftentimes without anyone knowing that that's what they're doing. But first thing I want to do though is I actually want to take a moment and look at this organizational website. So I can't actually see your chat, but I want you to post in the chat anyway. What do you notice about this organization? It's called the Save Our Species Alliance. Does anything stand out to you? Some of the things that stand out to me, I look at the logo, I see that there's a bunch of different animals in it. In the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you see a bald eagle, which is the poster child of endangered species in the US. And then I've highlighted some text in a couple areas. And these are two key points because what they're doing is they're talking about what their goals are and why they're doing what they're doing. So they say that we want to help species recover so they can come off the list, the endangered species list. And they actually want to change the Endangered Species Act so that they can modernize it because they want to help more species recover. So do you guys buy that? Do you think that's true? If we do a little digging, what we find is that it's kind of the opposite. So if we look at the director of the Save Our Species Alliance, his name is Tim Wigley, and while he was the director, he was also the executive vice president of PacWest Communications. And PacWest Communications has a bunch of clients in the forestry industry. He also was the former president of the Oregon Forest Industries Council. So he has a huge background in vested interest in the lumber industry. And when we take that into account, what we start to see is that what this organization is saying they're doing and what they're actually doing might not be the same thing. Public Citizen, which is a citizen advocacy organization, had this to say. The Save Our Species Alliance, an entity that sought to gut the Endangered Species Act, is a particularly Orwellian example of a group's name suggesting the opposite of its true goals. And so this organization is what we would call a corporate front group. Now, there's not necessarily one true definition of what a corporate front group is. The definition that I use is that they are civil society organizations, and they've been formed or funded or co-opted in such a way that they are advancing the interests of industry or advancing the interests of firms and corporations, but they're doing it while obscuring those ties. Now, these civil society organizations or things that look like that can take the form of any type of group that you're used to seeing. So it might look like a grassroots uprising, or it could look like it's doing issue advocacy work. It could be a membership organization or even research institutes. So pretty much any type of civil society organization that you're used to seeing and thinking it's authentic could actually, in effect, be doing the work of firms and industry. Now, let's talk about data because from what I've just said, these are organizations that are inherently trying to hide what they do and who they are. So how do you study this? And it turns out it's actually pretty difficult. There's very little research so far on how energy industries and companies use these types of organizations. So which ones they create and how they use them. There is a group called SourceWatch, or there's a project called SourceWatch, which is run by the Center for Media and Democracy. And they put together a list of purported front groups. But other than that, there's a few organizations here and there that try to call them out, but there's not one central database of them, which is actually what I'm working on currently. So I have an ongoing project where I started with the SourceWatch data and I'm trying to extend it. I'm trying to create the world's largest, most complete set of purported front groups. I had a couple research assistants that were identifying named corporate friend groups from academic articles, also doing media searches and using whistleblower documents. Because we don't have any laws in the US that say that you have to disclose your donors if you are a nonprofit, there's no tried and true way of figuring out if an organization is a front group or is not a front group. Sometimes we find out from whistleblower documents. Other times we can find out if they're a political action committee and they're mandated to report these things. But generally speaking, we have to talk about purported or accused front groups. So the next two slides actually come from my research. This was on the SourceWatch data. And I went through and collected reams and reams of information of each of these front groups and coded it. And two things I came up with. One was looking at the funding sources or the accused funding sources, trying to figure out which industries are really paying for these types of organizations. And as you can see, energy is one of the major contributors to the use of front groups. And this might actually even be underreported, as oftentimes to hide the trail of money, corporations will either fund these front groups through foundations or they'll do it through industry associations. The other one you'll see that's pretty high is tobacco, and that's because they lost a court case that required them to release all of their internal documents. So a tobacco might actually be, in comparison, a bit overreported because we know about nearly every one of their front groups. The other thing I took a look at was the tactics they use. So we have these organizations, going around portraying themselves as being these authentic things, but what are they actually doing with all the resources that they have? And as you can see, the three main things is most of them say they're doing education in some way. They're often targeting public opinion in one way or another. Most of them do some bit of media relations, and a lot of them are involved in lobbying. But we do see differences. So some of them are grassroots organizing, some are doing research. Those are the ones that look like research institutes. All right. So with the time that I have left, I want to run through a couple examples because this was all very theoretical, but I want this to feel a bit more concrete. So take a look at these pictures, and you can say this in the comments again. What do you think is going on in these three pictures? What is the theme that sort of ties them together? So all of these represent the results of acid rain. And we know acid rain, I actually just learned this, can turn lakes to be somewhat gelatinous. Strips the leaves and branches from trees, and as we see with this lion statue, can erode buildings and sculptures. Now, we in the US many years ago had a massive problem with acid rain. And it turns out we had that problem for about 2 years longer than we needed to because of a corporate front group. So Citizens for Sensible Control of Acid Rain was an organization that was trying to fight instilling laws that would help clean up our environment and prevent acid rain from continuing. And they launched a postcard and letter writing campaign trying to make it seem like there were all of these citizens that were not really wanting the legislation to go through. What they weren't telling people was that they were actually an organization created and paid for by the electricity industry, the coal industry, and manufacturing firms. And they were hugely effective. So these front groups matter. Another example, so this is one from West Virginia. The coal industry has really been hammered in that part of the country, and wanting to reinstill in the identity of West Virginians. So what it means to be a West Virginian is to care about coal, to work in coal and support the coal industry. The Friends of Coal is the organization that was formed. And they have a women's auxiliary branch. And what that branch did was that it decided the best way to reinstill this culture of coal in West Virginia was to target children. And so they did a lot of work. They created this beautiful coloring book. This is one of the pages from it. And they actually got this into the curriculum, into the school system in West Virginia. So again, another very effective organization. And then finally, we have Citizens for Sensible Energy Choices. So in Colorado, when they were trying to pass a renewable portfolio standard, they're having trouble. So they turned to a public amendment, Amendment 37. And when that happened, this new organization formed, Citizens for Sensible Energy Choices. And Mac McClellan was the spokesperson, that's his picture. And he says that our members, so they have real people, will be those who are concerned about possible rate increases as a result of the initiative. So these are just, regular folks that care about the cost of energy. But what it actually turns out is that this individual was actually working in public relations, in government relations for an electricity company. And when we look up their information online, what we find is that they were nearly 100% funded by the electricity industry. Despite how many times they used Citizen in their name or talked about their members, they didn't actually have any. So I'm going to leave you with those 3 examples. I really look forward to talking to you more about front groups. And my contact information is there because this is one of my favorite topics, and I'm always happy to geek out and talk more about it. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jocelyn. And what a great exercise in critical thinking, as we stress all the time in SISE. Know your sources and what are they really saying. Let's move on. Eric Noes, and I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Would you like to say a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for having me here today. It's just truly an honor to be here and a pleasure to see all the great work that's being done. And I look forward to hearing from the fellows and getting some questions later. So my name is Eric Nost. I don't really care about the pronunciation. I'm an assistant professor of geography at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Canada, outside of Toronto. And just to say a little bit about my background, I'm not actually originally from Canada. I grew up in the States, in Iowa. I did my master's in geography at the University of Kentucky and a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I bounced around the Midwest and the broader Midwest and Great Lakes region for quite a while now. And I'm fortunate to be in the position I am at the university today. And for me, it's the privilege is really about being able to bring together 3 sort of key things: teaching, reading, and writing. Now, of course, you can do those things in any kind of position, whether it's as an environmental consultant, working for a nonprofit, so on and so forth. Those are skills that are applicable in any sort of domain. But for me, those things, as they relate to the topic I'm most passionate about, environmental awareness, protection, environmental issues, they come together in a unique way in the academy. And I also have the opportunity to do public engagement work and to be involved in organizations like the one I'm really here representing today, which is the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. So I'm on the coordinating committee of what we call EDGI. And just I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Just to say a little bit about EDGI. EDGI formed in late 2016 in response to the election and taking seriously some of the threats that then President-elect Trump was making about sort of reversing and rolling back environmental regulations, as well as potential threats to environmental data that the federal government creates and hosts and makes available to the public. And so over the years, EDGI has done a lot of different projects, but one that we've started recently that I'm going to focus my presentation on today is called the Environmental Enforcement Watch, or what we call EW. I should note that I'm here again, talking on behalf of a project that is one part of EW, and here are some of the collaborators and co-conspirators that I have in this project. So it's a big group, and we're all working furiously right now to bring this project together. And this EU project is all about leveraging the existing environmental data that agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, make available to the public about the state of our environment, about industries and how much they pollute, that sort of thing, as well as also acknowledging some of the flaws in our environmental data infrastructure. So just as a way of getting into this, you know, you can put your answers to this in the chat. I can't see your, but I'm curious to hear what you come up with. If you want to define greenhouse gas emissions for, say, this past year, or, you know, over the past decade, for, you know, some place in the U.S. So your hometown might not actually be the U.S., but let's just say some place in the U.S. You know, where would you go to find that data, to find that information? Where would you even start to look that up? This is a really important question, right? If you know, just to get a sense of what is the condition of the environment around you, what is your area's contribution to climate change? I mean, you know, this is a really pressing question. You might also be interested, well, not just my neighborhood, but what about the congressional district I live in? This is political ramifications. What has the representative, my congressperson, done over the past few years in regards to climate change? Have emissions increased, decreased? So some of you might have, you know, said, well, I'd go to the EPA, the US Environmental Protection Agency, to get some of this data. Given that they are the agency that Congress is charged with ensuring that our environment is protected. And if, you know, this, unlike EPA's main climate change page, epa.gov/climate-change, which was removed in early 2017 from public access, this page, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, is actually still live, and it's still a program that is running, and it essentially collates industry self-reported emissions each year for a variety of greenhouse gases. And so this might be a place you start at. Of course, you might also be interested in, you know, are the industries that are reporting greenhouse gases in compliance with other kinds of environmental protection laws? Are they releasing other kinds of pollutants, such as mercury or other kinds of air pollutants that we know are toxic to human health, and how many of those pollutants? And to find that information alongside the greenhouse gas info, you might go to what the EPA has called ECHO, the Enforcement and Compliance History Online. And this represents arguably the best kind of view we have of environmental pollution, as well as like legal compliance trends in the US. The problem is, you know, there are still some issues with public accessibility here. So, you know, you could look up a facility here. I'm looking at the Madison Gas and Electric Plant in Madison, Wisconsin. And I don't know about you, but for me, this is, you know, there's a lot here, and it's not very easy to digest. Okay, and if you looked at greenhouse gas emissions in particular, it's still kind of just a bunch of tables and charts that aren't necessarily easy to read. So, you know, there's some limitations to this beyond just not necessarily easy to navigate. In terms of what data is available to you, generally it's only the past 3 to 5 years. It's really focused in on the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and our hazardous waste legislation. We don't have laws around greenhouse gases and climate change, right? The good news, though, is that this is available. We at EDGI have tried to make it more accessible to the public, and it can be used to inform different kinds of activism around climate change, as well as other environmental issues and environmental justice issues. So this is what we're trying to do in the EU project, the Environmental Enforcement Watch project. We're organizing now online events, bringing together local partners, potentially communities, to work with a copy of the ECHO data that we've made to make a report about the condition of the environment in different places across the US, as well as holding industry accountable to environmental legislation. So these events are all about informing members of the public about what's going on, giving a space for people to share their stories about environmental compliance, creating compelling visualizations around that, and using the data that we have to figure out what's going on. So just one example, This weekend, we're actually holding an event with Sunrise, the Boston hubs. So I know you all will be hearing from MK Dorsey later around Sunrise. But we are looking particularly at a few congressional districts in Massachusetts. And I'm not going to run a demo of this kind of data analysis that we do, but I will show you a few of the outputs that we're able to look at making sense of this EPA data. So the EPA tracks 24,000 odd some facilities in Massachusetts. There's about 2,000 of those in the congressional district that Boston is in, or most of Boston, the Boston area. But only 14 of those actually report their greenhouse gas emissions to the EPA. And you can see kind of a ranking of those here that we provide for people. We map them out in our analysis. And this is just one example, one event that we're holding for Boston, but we could think about, this is something that could be done, with groups in Chicago or wherever. And it's not just greenhouse gases, right? So this is an example of Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act trends in Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District. And just to put a final touch on it, we know there are some issues with tracking greenhouse gas emissions, right? A power plant, for instance, might, be located in one spot, but it's actually supplying electricity to surrounding communities. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to locate or situate those emissions in that neighborhood when really the drivers for that, for those emissions are sort of elsewhere. And that's, a real kind of issue in real data gap in the ECHO data that EPA collates, our best source of environmental compliance trends across the country. So, those are some of the data gaps that we're trying to track in this project as well. But at the end of the day, we believe this is, very useful to the kinds of activism that you might go interested in terms of just creating examples of polluters to help, hold them accountable, pressuring lawmakers, kind of setting legislative targets, helping people engage in citizen science, providing professional development opportunities. This is just a few of the kinds of outcomes or outputs really that we are trying to pull together in these events. So look forward to talking with you more about these events and hearing from you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Wonderful presentation, and that will, I'm sure, stimulate lots of questions. Eric, thank you for that. Last panelist, Anna Wolf. And Anna, again, from CNT, Center for Neighborhood Technology. Could you tell us a little bit about your path to getting where you are now, and again, your passions and your work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear.
All right, perfect. So as was mentioned, my name is Anna Wolf. I'm a senior project manager at CNT, working alongside Marcella in our urban resilience department. And I have a kind of a circuitous path, I guess, to this place as well. I went to grad school, urban planning school, for with a focus on urban food systems initially, and worked a little bit in that space around food insecurity, food justice issues. But through an opportunity to have an internship at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, actually when I was in grad school, I worked with a former CNTer on water supply issues. And that, alongside my work on green stormwater management research while I was in grad school, sort of led me to a professional career in water systems management. So that's where I got to where I am right now. I've been at CNT for about 5 years, and my role there has transitioned from primarily focusing on stormwater management to a broader look at water systems infrastructure throughout primarily the Great Lakes Basin. But I think one of the most exciting things about working at CNT is our focus on holistic and sort of integrated urban planning, and everything being done through a lens of racial equity, social justice, and affordability. So that's an exciting lens that we bring to all of our work. So I'll go ahead and share my slides. Okay. Can you guys see the screen okay?
Not yet.
Okay. Still nothing?
Yeah, it still has not come up.
All right, 1 second.
Ah, now it's starting to appear, I think.
Okay.
There we go. We got it. And you might want to go to full screen. There we go. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about a data-driven approach to identifying the location of lead service lines in communities. So I've got a lot of slides to go through, and I'm going to try to provide a little bit of context around why we care about lead service line identification, and then talk about a bit about the work that CNT is doing in partnership with IBM and some data scientists at University of Michigan with two South suburban communities in Chicago. And George, feel free to cut me off when the time is up, and I can answer questions during the discussion portion if needed.
Okay, we'll do that.
All right, perfect. So what I first wanted to mention is the fact that we are currently in the age of water infrastructure investment. In 2017, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave Illinois' drinking water system a C-. The entire country has a D. This highlights the fact that much of our public water infrastructure, which in Illinois serves approximately 12 million people, was built in the first half of the 20th century and has faced insufficient investment over the decades. And this has led to infrastructure failures ranging from water quality concerns like lead and other contaminants getting into drinking water. It leads to system-wide leaks throughout the system, which cost consumers a lot of money. It costs the utilities a lot of money to repair. And this sort of water quality concerns paired with aging infrastructure leads to a need to increase rates to cover the costs of investment, which then leads to shut-off crises, unaffordable water bills, these sort of affordable water as a human rights issues. So I think the question behind a lot of CNT's work in this space is, if we know that investment in these systems has to go up, how do we employ, or how do we help utilities employ methods that ensure both clean water and customer affordability? So I'm going to sort of hone in on lead as a particular issue of concern, which I know has been in the news, and primarily because of the water quality crisis in Flint. But it's just a matter of fact that communities across the country have lead service lines. They've been used for centuries as a fixture in plumbing, and many other lead as a heavy metal has been used in paints and gas and piping, and so it's everywhere in our environment, and we're only recently starting to realize the health impacts of lead. So I just have a slide here showing a picture of lead used in ancient Roman pipes. Its Latin name is tied to plumum. So it's sort of inherently embedded in the way that we serve water or supply water to our communities. So lead pipes were used in water supply systems until the early 20th century, at which point communities and the federal government began to realize the health impacts. There is no safe level of lead in the bloodstream. It's a neurotoxin and it has chronic impacts if exposed. The EPA has set an action level at 15 parts per billion, but some cities have lowered that. Buffalo, for example, the city of Buffalo has lowered it to 5 parts per billion, which means that they're going to be taking action if they find lower levels of lead in a certain percentage of homes in their community. And the American Water Works Association estimates that approximately 15 to 22 million people across the country receive lead contaminated drinking water. So this is certainly not a single community that's faced with this challenge. And I referenced 2 pieces of legislation that are important for the ways that communities are taking action now. In 1986, of course, lead was banned from use in plumbing fixtures. Some cities banned it earlier than that, and Madison and Lansing, Michigan are 2 communities that were the first to fully replace lead service lines. So they sort of took a more proactive approach there. Chicago, however, in large part due to the plumbing union, required the use of lead up until the ban. So it wasn't until the late 80s that Chicago plumbing new developments were no longer going to be installed with lead service lines. And then the 1991 lead and copper rule instituted the sampling protocols, where every 3 years, every community in the US is required to submit a certain sample of water and copper testing results to the state EPA. And if levels are found above the action level, then they must take action. So there are a few interim risk mitigation measures that communities can take. Those include flushing water before you use it, drawing cold water from taps only, and then heating it up in another, like over the stove or an electric kettle, using filters, and then from the utility side, from the water service supplier side, implementing water system-wide corrosion control programs. But the best option to mitigate the risk of lead exposure is to remove the risk of lead exposure. So to do a complete service line replacement from the main water pipe in the middle of the road into the interior of the home. I did have a diagram showing that in some communities, the service line has a split ownership, which complicates the replacement matter, but we can get into that question if it comes up later. So the first step in doing a full service line replacement would be to identify lead service line locations. Some communities will have digital records of service line materials, some will have paper records. Many have no idea what's going on underground, just by the nature of record keeping as it changes over years, as you have new staff coming and going. It becomes challenging to create an historical picture of what's going on underground in our water supply, especially for the service line piece, which is not the big pipes in the ground, but the piece that's supplying water directly into the home. So the big question becomes back to this affordability piece. How do utilities tackle this issue while maintaining affordability for their customer base? And CMT, because we have this sort of love of data analytics and solving urban problems, we learned about a predictive analytical model that was developed by researchers at the University of Michigan for the city of Flint in the midst of its water quality crisis. So they developed this tool, this model that was able to get to a 70 to 90% accuracy at identifying where lead service lines were located in the community. So I'm just going to really quickly show some examples from their work. What they did was they collected a bunch of municipal data, and then they analyzed that initially and said, well, here's what the data are telling us about where lead is. And then they went into the field and vetted that initial desktop research. And they used digging sort of around the community at a random sample, and then brought those field inputs back into the machine or back into the model to create sort of a machine learning tool. And they had a really great accuracy rates through 2016 through 2017. When the city was using the University of Michigan model, they had a 70% accuracy rate of where they were going into the field and digging and finding a lead service line to replace. So that's a really great way of making sure you're digging and replacing as efficiently as possible. And then there were some issues with the city moved away from the model and the accuracy rate went back down to 15%. And then they returned to it and went back up. So it sort of proved the point that the model was working. So these are the sort of key level or key steps that a community would need to take to develop an inventory using predictive analytics. One, you want to collect as much data as possible. Two, you want to digitize and process the data so that it's quote unquote smart. So that means if you have hard copies of historical permits, you want to scan all of those, and then you might need to run an optical character recognition analysis so that you can bring the data into a database, connect every data point with a parcel, and then start to figure out, okay, what are our dependent and independent variables, and how can we create a model that's showing correlation between the presence of lead service line and specific property characteristics. And so then ultimately, if you wanted to do this the University of Michigan way, you would catalog which risk factors are most predictive in determining the presence of lead. And then you would identify other properties with those risk factors and sort of make some early desktop predictions, and then go out into the field and test your findings. Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly run through some of our work that we've done in the south suburbs. Illinois EPA requires every community to submit an inventory and disclose the total number of service lines. The latest inventory shows that at least 10% of service lines in Illinois are leaded, and 40% have an unknown material composition. So this is back to the point that we really don't know what's underground, and we need some help figuring that out. And then sort of zooming in on Cook County, 30% of Cook County's lines are estimated to be leaded. So CNT is working with a couple of south suburban communities, Flossmoor and Hazel Crest. I have some demographic information here, but just know that Flossmoor is on the wealthier end as compared to Cook County, and Hazel Crest is a little bit poorer. They're both majority Black African-American communities, and they're also both majority single-family home communities, which means they're likely to have a preponderance of lead service lines throughout the community, or at least this type of service line in the community could be lead. If you have a higher density, larger buildings, there's a lesser likelihood that they're served by a lead service line. So in the inventory that they submitted to EPA, they both reported a majority of their service lines as unknown material composition. So what we did was we went through and brought together or pulled as much data as we could from Flossmoor and Hazel Crest, looking at assessors data, at a master list of addresses for lead and copper sampling, any other supporting data we could find through their building records, and many of the data sets we got were incomplete. And so we're still sort of doing the analytical piece here, but the next step in our research will be to come up with a predictive model that is incomplete, and then the villages will be tasked with going out into the field and testing the early results, and then sort of developing a more comprehensive replacement plan. So I have some more slides here, but I know that I'm at time, so maybe I'll pause there and see if it makes sense to just move into the discussion.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate it. And we did hear a lot from the panelists on using data in creative ways and being sure that you know what you're talking about. I think that maybe is becoming more rare in our society. I'm sorry to say it. But we do have plenty of time for questions. Lots of questions were coming in from the fellows. And let's see, who should I call on? I think, Liz, you had a question about policy initiatives to flatten the impact of injustice across income and racial lines. Would you like to ask that question?
Was this the one I suggested for all panelists?
Yes, that's the one.
Sorry, I've been typing like mad in the meantime.
Good for you.
Each of you are really focused on making sure that the impacts of the negative impacts are dispersed equitably, and that mitigation is also directed where it's needed the most. Are there policies that are being presented right now or that need to be presented that you feel would solve those problems? What should we look for when we're researching how to fix these?
Anybody like to answer that? Good general question.
So I don't know that I have a direct answer to that, but I can say a little bit about something.
You do, yeah.
So the research I talked about probably is least applicable to this question, but I do have some other research in Detroit where I have collected data, worked with urban agriculture, so farmers in Detroit, and then another project where I didn't do the data, but it's on water actually, and the shutdowns in Detroit. And my co-author and I have been talking a lot about intersectionality and environmentalism. And I think, stepping back from the policy side. So, policy oftentimes comes out of like our beliefs and our culture and how we're addressing things. And I think it's, we don't see policies that are equitable across communities, often because it is, a lot of white people often from wealthier areas writing these, and we don't have to think about those issues. So I can't really speak to like what policies are on the docket or what's coming up. But I do think that we also need to look beyond policy to cultural change and the way that we do research, who's doing research, and all of those issues, just making all of this much more intersectional.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I mean, I agree. I think the sort of the tendency is for us to think, what can we as an individual do? But really, we need to think about what can we as part of institutions do, and what are the systemic causes for these things, which may or may not be consciously done, right? They may be historical. And so once you start to piece together the puzzle of the historical and the current reasons for why these statistics are happening, then you can start to have targeted responses. But those responses need to be led by the people who are most impacted. And often those people are going to be your best experts. So there's a certain point at which we lean into our data and we say this is definitely the truth. But honestly, it's only ever a piece of the puzzle. I think C&T's report is a good example of that. Not everybody has home insurance, right? Or knows how to get through the flood insurance claim process. So all of those people are voiceless in our data. And that's why we also did structured interviews and had community forums and maintained an outreach effort. And those communities and those residents will be the ones to lead the way in shaping the policies that are actually appropriate, as opposed to ones that may have unintended negative consequences.
Any other panelists like to comment?
I just briefly weigh in there that's something that we are certainly, thinking through as we prepare these EU events, the Environmental Enforcement Watch events, where, we are trying to make the EPA's data on environmental enforcement and compliance and pollution trends much more accessible, but not trying to just run this for the entire country and just shove it out there, but to partner and collaborate with organizations and community groups to help them tell the stories and ask the questions that they want to, rather than us kind of imposing on high. I would also say that the environmental justice dimensions of the Green New Deal and a focus on crafting toxics responses that take into account the fact that certain communities are marginalized more than others. I think that's very promising. And that's something that we're kind of advocating for too. A lot of the data that we're talking about that the EPA has is self-reported by industry. Somebody mentioned that in the questions. That's an issue because it's essentially, it's not necessarily easy for the EPA to follow up and verify that. So there are, potentially ways to, legislate, create policy that would make it easier for communities to know what's happening around them. And I think that the framework in the Green New Deal is there for it.
Great comment. Let's see, Valerie, you had a question, the recent one about the difficulty of collecting health data from minority communities. Would you like to ask that?
Sure. Yes. Thank you very, very much for your presentation. As somebody who is extremely passionate about environmental justice, it's been excellent to hear your different perspectives and extremely inspiring. I was just wondering, as a historian, environmental historian, it's often historically very, very difficult to collect, to nearly impossible to collect health data from minority communities. So I was just wondering, for future studies or different things, is there a way in which this barrier can be overcome, or that you've maybe heard? And I guess that can go out to all panelists, it's not specifically to one.
Who'd like to take a crack at that one?
Well, this isn't, I guess I'm sort of adding on a limitation here from at least the lead service line replacement perspective, but we, one thing that I was really interested in looking at early on was, well, can we look at zip codes with elevated blood lead levels in these communities and use that as a factor for like a predictive factor in the tool, and that those data, as you say, are just not available due to HIPAA compliance as well as the way that they're aggregated. So we just sort of had to identify that as a limitation. I know some communities like the city of Buffalo has made those EBLL data available and are using them as they prioritize where to make investments in their water system, but that's certainly not a practice across the board. But we've talked about at C&T, outside of the lead service line piece, the ways we can engage public health practitioners in conversation around, we know that there are many community benefits tied to green stormwater infrastructure beyond just the stormwater management. I'm sorry, there's a garbage truck. That's on my own. Maybe I'll pass it to Marcella
So just to, I guess, follow up on that, I'm not sure exactly where Anna was going with with the end of that story, but I guess I'll say, think about why certain communities don't want to give you their data because they probably have a really valid reason. And that reason needs to be addressed before you're going to collect it. It's not just a matter of they don't understand, they understand, right? They care about their kids. But when you are in a community that has been historically targeted for enforcement or are at risk for deportation or are simply dealing daily with aggressions against your community, no, answering a health survey is not high on your list. So address those first, and then, you know, have some community messengers that can perhaps explain the purpose of this, but then also question why you need the data, right? Are you there as a partner? Are you there to extract some information and publish it?
Great answer. Panelists, any other comments? So here's a question from Kenneth. You were asking about connecting environmental issues to local communities. Would you like to ask that question to the panel directly?
Yeah, I'll do that. So I appreciate that all of you connect environmental issues with issues that are important to local communities. Through my observations, though, many environmentalists, especially white ones, often fail to connect these issues. Why do you think this is so?
Good question. We heard a lot about flooding, for example, a wonderfully local problem.
I'm not sure I caught the entire question. Do you want to rephrase, George?
So there's a lot of local environmental issues around a power plant. Flooding in Chicago is a great example. But you hear a lot more environmental talk about national issues or global issues, climate change, for example, which goes throughout the world. Why? It seems to be a disconnect. So the focus on local issues, where the impact is actually felt, can be very specific, while the sort of global issues or national issues are more abstract, and they seem maybe a bit more remote to the general public.
Well, I might.
Sorry, just joining in, Kenneth, because you specifically mentioned white populations. Is that, I want to make sure that we get your question exactly how you want it.
Yeah, I've studied environmental studies in a predominantly white institution with predominantly white professors. Most of the time, I feel like my perspective doesn't align with theirs. Another way to rephrase my question is, why is there such a white bias within the environmental community?
I think that historically there have been some very racist foundations to what we consider to be big environmentalism, right? So we may not want to hear this history, but some conservationists took positions that were, you know, harmful to indigenous populations, for example. So I think there are certain historical threads there, and certain organizations, really large organizations that get the majority of the media attention and the funding, and maybe in that older paradigm. But I know many environmentalists who are also people of color who care about conservation or care about climate change, in addition to local concerns like public health and affordability and how that intersects with the built environment. So I think it's really more a matter of who gets attention and who gets money. And I am a little encouraged to see that the bigger green organizations are starting to realize that they're missing a big piece of the puzzle and to share resources with more grassroots and more community-based groups. But I would say that for CNT, you know, for a long time, there was a focus on green infrastructure because it has all these co-benefits, but we didn't necessarily understand the full impact of or the importance of messaging around flooding until we had these community conversations. I think for us that was a really impactful exercise, shifting us from water quality to targeting a specific issue relevant to ordinary people.
Panelists, any other comment?
Yeah, I think that
go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead, Eric.
oh, great. Yeah, I would just, I think this is a really important question. I appreciate Kenneth, you asking that. I appreciate Marcella's response. Yeah, I would just, and echo all of it, I would say that also, I think that when you start to realize that, you know, flooding or any other environmental issue, even climate change, when you start to realize that it's not just a biophysical problem, a matter of too many, you know, carbon molecules in the atmosphere or too much water in a certain place, when you realize that it's also a social issue in terms of, you know, how much money do certain kinds of people have, how much power do they have, so on and so forth, then the problem becomes, then it's a question about redistributing that power, and so I think that has made it so that historically white-led environmentalist groups and conservation groups do not try to tackle those problems, because it means addressing these bigger questions of power and potentially upsetting that balance of power that has benefited them in the past. Yeah, I mean, I think we are starting to see that start to unravel, but yeah.
Great comment. And I think, did another panelist want to comment?
I did.
Yeah, please go ahead, Jocelyn.
So, I mean, those are great comments too. And I would just add from the individual perspective, especially, I guess I am a white person who identifies as an environmentalist. There's a huge amount of privilege there, right? So especially if you're living in cities in the US, I mean, I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, Ann Arbor, Chicago, DC. These are hugely segregated places. And so if you're white, and care about environmental issues, you're probably upper middle or higher income levels and never having to see the issues that people that live in other communities face. And so when you're thinking about, you know, I care about environmental things, what do I care about? The things that are impacting you are going to be these larger sort of broader global issues like climate change. You know, you'd have to really take the time to, you know, like do anti-racism work and learn history and step outside your bubble in order to recognize that, you know, there are marginalized communities of color, lower income areas that, you know, don't even have drinking water, don't have clean drinking water, have huge infrastructure projects being put into their communities. And so I think we see too, this difference with white environmentalism because of that privilege. Us as like privileged white people haven't had to think about these issues.
And Shayna, I think you had a comment related to this, your most recent one.
Yeah, not really a question, but I was just noting that environmental issues are often deeply rooted in social injustices, and I'm really glad that you guys are taking the time to discuss some of these issues today and, you know, acknowledge that they're there.
And Owen, if I am pronouncing correctly, you had a question also about who gets the most attention.
Yes, I had a question about when it comes to creating a space online for data and what the process looks like for presenting the data, making it easy to search, particularly for a population that does not have the background that many of us do. And so I found that I'm very biased as a researcher and as a scientist to organize the data, question it in a way that I would understand, but often like neglecting how somebody else, who I eventually want them to be able to access the data, will think about asking that question. So based on y'all's experience, how did you get out of that bias so that we can present the information that the public needs to see and make it easy, very easy for them to understand? And oftentimes these are very sort of complex sorts of data that we're dealing with.
Panelists, what do you think?
Well, I can quickly say from CNT's perspective, our primary goal when we're working on an urban issue that has a data-driven or data-supported solution is to make sure that we're partnering with, as Marcella mentioned earlier, the right messenger for the community and using that as a venue to be present in community meetings or block club groups and make sure that we're listening and collecting information and being reactive and responsive to the needs of the community. And if there's an opportunity for us to help visualize or tell a story using data, then we're engaging folks in the initial conversation about what that story is, what the question is, and then making sure that there's an iterative feedback loop of like, here's what we've found so far, what are we missing, what would you like to add, and sort of removing ourselves from the decision-making aspect and just as like a facilitator in the quest for the use of data as a storytelling tool.
Great. Thanks. That's very humbling to say, to be able to remove yourselves from the decision-making process. That's not really easy to do. So thanks for pointing that out.
Panelists, any other comments from the panelists?
Just very quickly, I think this is an excellent question. It's like at the core of what we're trying to figure out at EDGI and with the Environmental Enforcement Watch. And certainly we don't have an answer really, but I would echo this focus on partner collaboration and not trying to drive our own narrative through the process and to make all the decisions. Just maybe a bit more specifically, we do that through events, and that provides a kind of space where it's not just all about like what's online and the data being there, but a more collaborative kind of conversation where we're working with the data, figuring out the questions, processing the answers in a single space, so to speak, or time. Also, although I didn't really show this, I think trying to translate the information into meaningful metrics as possible. So it's one thing to talk about like, millions of metric tons of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. It's another thing to like make that a bit more meaningful to say, well, that's the equivalent of, 10,000 households or whatever. I think that's one approach. And we've also, maybe not for this project in particular, but EDGI as a whole has been pretty successful in working with the media to kind of translate what we're finding and seeing and what our community partners are interested in as well, and getting the media to write a potentially more accessible and engaging and perhaps even more in-depth look at a particular issue.
Thank you.
Great comment. Let's see, Carly, you had a comment about accountability, power disparity, and who holds the information. Would you like to ask that question?
Sure, thank you. And this is coming from, I'm a librarian, so when I see there's like all of this information and like, how are we connecting people with the information is the question that's always in my head. And Eric, you started talking about it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you or some of the other panelists can even just describe in detail like an event or a specific organization that you connected with and how they used the data. I'm just curious about what this information looks like in action.
So yeah, I mean, I can just start us off here. So I can give a couple examples. I mean, I will say that this particular project, the Environmental Enforcement Watch, is just getting underway. And so that's also part of the reason why you're not necessarily finding it on the Google search that somebody mentioned earlier. But yeah, I mean, so we've done a few events. We've done this event with the Sunrise Boston hubs. And yeah, sorry, so the specific question about what this event looks like, we model it around 4 different tracks. So we have this data on different parts of from the EPA, water issues, air issues, greenhouse gases, hazardous waste. And we kind of break out and each group kind of looks at each of those issues. And then we bring it back together and kind of synthesize what did we see across these issues in the place that we're focused on, the congressional district surrounding Boston. And then we do a further breakout that's actually a bit more focused on like adding more research and contextualization, doing more with the visualization of the data, telling stories from this or trying to investigate potential stories from this. So it's not like we assume all the data is already there. We realize that there's a lot more context that needs to be there and done with it, the data. And so that's explicitly structured into the events.
And in that case, was it just like an open event to the community at large? Was it for a specific group of people? How did people learn about and get invited to the event?
So that's through the Sunrise community, but
okay.
That could be a model going forward. It's just more open. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Juzel, if I'm saying your name right, you had a question for
Giselle.
Giselle, sorry about that.
It's okay. We have 2 more days, so you'll get it. Thank you for the presentations. This question was specifically for Jocelyn, but the other panelists can pitch in as well. You mentioned that nonprofits don't have a requirement to disclose their donors currently. I think it's reasonable that they should be required to disclose it, just to prevent those corporate front groups. But I was wondering if you agreed with this, or if you thought of any other reasons why nonprofits wouldn't want to disclose their donors, even if they're a legitimate organization, just to speak on that perspective, because it is a possibility. And what are other policies that you might have in mind to really bring the legalities against preventing these types of fund groups?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you. So there actually has been several points in time where they've tried to push legislation through in the US to make front groups in some way or another be constrained. And what I've seen happen, I'm not as familiar with this side of it, but it seems like the nonprofit world does not want the change to be that they have to disclose donors. So part of that pushback has been like, if that's the mechanism that they use, that you have to report all the money you get and who it comes from, then it's not just the front groups that don't want it, it's also the nonprofits. And I imagine, I don't know, this is just sort of like spitballing, it could be the aspect where some donors want to stay anonymous. And so it's not because it's a shady, corporation trying to use money as influence. It's just, nonprofits wanting that ability to accept money without having a name tied to it. As far as other things that could be done, perhaps this is signifying who has to disclose. So if you are doing lobbying, maybe then we make it so groups that lobby have to disclose donors, or maybe you only have to disclose corporate donors. I imagine there's probably some sort of like happy medium where legitimate nonprofits would not object to changes, but that it would still target the corporate front groups. The other issue is that they don't always organize as a nonprofit. So that would only call out front groups that have actually filed that paperwork. But if they're trying to look like a grassroots organization, it's so rare that grassroots uprisings go through the process of becoming a nonprofit. So it's actually really complicated because with all these different forms, we probably need different mechanisms for each one to sort of ensure that there's more accountability.
Okay, thank you so much.
Other panelists want to comment on that? So 3 questions are closely related. Barbara, Victoria, and Melody about how to present complicated data in a way that is compelling to a broad audience. And Barbara, maybe I could ask you to ask your question.
Hi, so I have seen, like, not only in the US, but also in my country, in South America, that it's very difficult for academia or the scientific community to explain complex information or data to a broad audience, like society in general. So how do we overcome that challenge of explaining things in a simple way? more than just like having like partnerships with other people who are experts in social skills and um, giving the message, how can we do as academia and scientific community to learn more about how to inform and how to talk to broad audiences?
Who'd like to take a crack at that? I think it's an excellent question, and we scientists face this all the time. We think technically we're nerds and geeks, and we love to talk to each other, but how about to the common person?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, Barbara, until you said not just partners, but how can we sort of better embed that approach in the way that we work? I was going to say partners, make sure you're working with the right messenger. But I also think it comes down to the organization actually wanting to be able to communicate the message, the analysis, the research that they're doing with the stakeholders that are benefiting from that research or that have requested that research. I think a lot of times, as we've talked about, there's been an historical focus on sometimes using data as a way to separate the folks that work in academia and education and folks that don't. And so it's sort of inherent to like, well, I'm using all of these data and charts and graphs and it's complicated, which means it's true. And that I think acknowledging that the presenting data as a tool for sort of democracy and democratizing engagement and understanding of issues is something that organizations have to themselves take a close look at and sort of commit to, and then work through the process of what does that mean? How do we do that internally, that work internally? And I think a part of that is done through messaging and making sure you have the right partnerships, but it also is some hard work on the organization itself or on the organization side. And I'll just mention one thing. I noticed that a chat came through about using art to help with that messaging. And I do think that's a powerful tool. And one thing that CNT has done through one of our projects around climate and cultural resilience has been to partner with local artists and community-based organizations to create messaging around why climate resilience is important for community engagement and investment in resiliency. And I think art is a great way to sort of more creatively think about that messaging.
Any other panelists like to comment?
I would just say on the academic side, I can't speak for all fields, but in mine, there's a bigger issue than just communicating the information and the data to broader audiences, which is that there's no incentive to do so. So my career trajectory is based on publishing in so-called A journals, and very little else counts for me. And so if I spend time translating or trying to get my, the knowledge I create out to the public, that could actually even be frowned upon based on the tenure system that's in place. I know there's a movement in the management field of academia, which I think is about 20,000 professors, to try and change how tenure is done so that impact is part of that equation. But right now, without impact being part of that equation, I could actually sort of get dinged if I don't have enough APUBs, but I spent time getting my knowledge out there.
Any other comments? So we have a couple of minutes left, and I'm seeing a lot in the chat that many of the fellows really appreciate this session for various reasons. And Louis, I think you were one of the first ones to say something about that. Would you like to just make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, something that I noticed right off the bat is everybody here that was presenting had a full range of data from A to Z. And then on top of that, you guys are doing the actual activism too, not just data reporting. So your operations and representations. So I really appreciate that. And then one question that I came across while I was listening was kind of piggybacking off of the last question about using art to disseminate your guys' information to the public. If it's not maybe like a full report that people could read and kind of go through and figure out, I know during my intelligence studies, one of the best ways that the intelligence community uses dissemination of information is by creating like a nice little 1-page, 1-slide graphic. And then the graphic can be used for any number of things, whether it's just like an eye-opening like statistic, or if it's just a quick little excerpt about like why it's important with the data that's projected of how something's going to change negatively. But I was wondering if you guys feel it necessary within your organizations to implement that with each of the reports that you guys send out or conduct or anything like that.
Panelists?
Yeah, C&T generally, not necessarily for all of our projects, but for many of them, especially if there's a community-based focus, we'll have sort of a 1 or 2 pager, which outlines the highlights of the research and has some graphics and visualizations of if we've done any data analysis, and then we'll have a larger report. And I can just point to one concrete example of our rain ready planning work that we've done in the south suburbs of Chicago, south of Chicago, in the Calumet corridor. We developed full like stormwater management, green infrastructure oriented plans for 6 communities, they were very long, sort of robust plans. But for each community, we also developed a citizens action guide, which was 2-3 pages max, I think, of the highlights, the bullets of what citizens can do themselves to help manage stormwater on their property, as well as the overarching recommendations we put forward in the larger report. So it's a way of sort of a digestible resource for community stakeholders.
Great comment. We are running out of time, and in view of time, I think we should wrap it up. But I do want to express enormous appreciation to the panelists. The presentations were outstanding, generated a lot of questions. Enormous appreciation to the fellows. We could not get to every question, and that's a very good thing. There's still chances to communicate with the panelists and with each other. So I hope we can do that. And it's a good intro to the rest of the day, in fact, which we'll hear MK Dorsey keynote at 12:45, and then another panel at let me get the time right. Hey, Thomas, take us out if you would.
Sure. Great job, everybody. Thanks so much to our panelists. So excited to have you. We will be back at 12:45 p.m. With MK Dorsey keynoting. There'll be a couple of questions from fellows, and then that'll lead into the second panel of the day. And that is what I lovingly refer to as the boots on the ground. People who are out there making a change in their communities and in their respective fields as well, including Sunrise movement, as well as another SISE alumni. So that'll be great to see them. So thanks everybody, and appreciate it to all the panelists and fellows. We'll see you back at 12:45.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.